You know that moment when you're in a heated discussion and suddenly you notice something remarkable happening around you. The women in the room aren't just participating in the conversation, they're dissecting it, questioning the underlying assumptions, connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information, and arriving at insights that leave everyone else wondering how they got there so quickly. In classrooms where female students ask the questions that make professors pause and reconsider their own expertise. What you're witnessing isn't just intelligence, it's a specific type of cognitive processing that Jean Piaget, the revolutionary Swiss psychologist, identified as fundamentally different in how it develops and manifests. How often have you attributed that piercing insight to luck, intuition, or even coincidence? How frequently have you found yourself thinking that maybe she was just overthinking things, being too analytical, or making things more complicated than they needed to be? You've been conditioned, we all have, to expect critical thinking to look a certain way, sound a certain way, emerge from certain sources. We've built systems, institutions, and cultures that fail to nurture and leverage one of humanity's most sophisticated forms of cognitive development. The result is a world operating at a fraction of its intellectual potential, solving problems with only half the tools available, making decisions with incomplete cognitive resources. Today, I'm going to reveal something that will fundamentally change how you understand intelligence, critical thinking, and human potential. You're going to discover the specific cognitive structures that enable this unique form of thinking, understand the developmental stages that must be navigated for it to flourish, and learn to identify and cultivate these capabilities in yourself and others. The story that changed everything began in Geneva, Switzerland, in 1927, when Jean Piaget, then a young researcher working with Alfred Binet on intelligence testing, encountered something that would reshape our understanding of human cognition forever. The established protocol was straightforward. Record the right answers, note the wrong ones, calculate the scores, and move on to the next subject. They were approaching problems from angles that the tests hadn't anticipated, asking questions about the questions themselves, and demonstrating cognitive flexibility that transcended the narrow parameters of standardized assessment. Maria, an 8-year-old girl from a working-class family in Geneva, was presented with a classic conservation task. Piaget showed her 2 identical glasses filled with equal amounts of water, then poured the water from one glass into a taller, thinner container. Maria looked at both containers, then back at Piaget, and asked a question that stopped him in his tracks. She then proceeded to explain not just that the amounts were equal, but described 3 different ways of proving it, questioned whether the slight difference in water level might be due to evaporation during the transfer, and wondered aloud whether the shape of the containers might affect how people naturally perceive volume. Maria hadn't simply applied logical thinking to reach a conclusion. She had simultaneously analyzed the problem, questioned the premise, considered multiple variables, anticipated alternative explanations, and reflected on the thinking process itself. She was demonstrating what Piaget termed equilibration, the dynamic process of balancing assimilation of new information with accommodation of existing cognitive structures. But she was doing it with a sophistication that challenged his understanding of childhood cognitive development. Over the following months, Piaget meticulously documented similar patterns across dozens of female subjects. Perhaps most significantly, they showed remarkable capacity for what he termed cognitive bridging, the ability to connect seemingly unrelated concepts and identify patterns across different domains of knowledge. These young females weren't simply thinking more logically or analytically. They were engaging in what he would later describe as integrative critical thinking, a cognitive process that combined logical analysis with emotional intelligence, contextual awareness, and relational understanding. Take the case of Sophie, a 10-year-old who participated in Piaget's famous mountain experiment. Most children her age struggled to mentally rotate their perspective and remained locked in their own viewpoint. She wanted to know if the person viewing from the north side might see things differently, not just because of physical position, but because of their purpose for being there. This led Piaget to a profound realization about the nature of critical thinking development. They could operate within traditional logical frameworks when required, but they also possessed alternative approaches to processing information and solving problems. The implications were staggering. Traditional educational models emphasized linear, sequential thinking and rewarded students who could efficiently apply predetermined logical processes to reach expected conclusions. You know that feeling when you're trying to explain something important, something you can see clearly, but others seem to miss entirely, and you start to wonder if maybe you're the one who's seeing things wrong. I want you to think about a specific moment, maybe recent, maybe from years ago, when you offered a perspective that was ultimately proven right, but was initially dismissed or undervalued. How did that feel? What did you tell yourself about your own judgment in that moment? If this resonates with you, if you've experienced that particular cocktail of certainty and self-doubt, I want you to leave a comment with this simple phrase. Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to read today, to realize they're not overthinking, they're not too sensitive, they're not making things complicated unnecessarily. They're demonstrating a form of intelligence that our world desperately needs but rarely acknowledges. You have more power to validate and encourage this type of thinking than you realize. He discovered that it wasn't simply a matter of intelligence or education level. There were particular developmental experiences and environmental factors that seemed to foster these capabilities. He documented case after case of young women who demonstrated what he called contextual intelligence, the ability to understand that truth and meaning often depend on circumstances, relationships, and underlying assumptions. The research revealed 3 distinct types of critical thinking development that Piaget observed. Type 1 was traditional analytical thinking, characterized by linear progression through logical steps, systematic elimination of variables, and focus on reaching definitive conclusions. This approach excelled in complex, ambiguous situations where multiple factors needed to be considered simultaneously and where human implications were significant. Through longitudinal studies following children into adulthood, Piaget discovered that individuals who developed strong, integrative critical thinking capabilities often became exceptional problem solvers in fields requiring nuanced understanding of human behavior, complex systems thinking, and innovative approaches to persistent challenges. But he also documented the dangers of failing to recognize and nurture these capabilities. Many of his subjects reported feeling intellectually displaced throughout their educational experiences. This led to what Piaget termed cognitive suppression, where individuals learn to hide or minimize their natural thinking patterns in order to fit into environments that only valued traditional analytical approaches. On a personal level, cognitive suppression led to decreased confidence in one's own judgment, reduced willingness to offer insights or challenge conventional thinking, and gradual disconnection from one's natural intellectual strengths. Piaget's work revealed that developing integrative critical thinking required what he called cognitive scaffolding, a carefully structured process of supporting increasingly sophisticated thinking patterns. Phase 2 required exposure to problems that couldn't be solved through purely analytical approaches, situations that demanded consideration of context, relationships, and unintended consequences. Piaget found that even individuals with natural aptitude for integrative critical thinking could lose these capabilities if they were consistently reinforced for using only traditional analytical approaches. The key was recognition that different types of thinking served different purposes, and optimal problem-solving often required the ability to move fluidly between approaches. Historical examples illustrated the power and importance of integrative critical thinking in addressing humanity's most pressing challenges. Barbara McClintock's revolutionary genetics research was initially dismissed by the scientific community because her insights challenged conventional understanding, but her ability to see patterns and connections that others missed eventually earned her a Nobel Prize and transformed our understanding of genetic inheritance. The Challenger space shuttle disaster occurred despite sophisticated technical analysis because decision-makers failed to adequately consider the human dynamics, communication patterns, and organizational pressures that were influencing the situation. These examples highlighted Piaget's central insight. Yet educational systems, organizational structures, and cultural norms continued to primarily recognize and reward traditional analytical approaches while undervaluing or dismissing the cognitive capabilities that Piaget had identified as equally important and often more relevant for addressing complex, real-world situations. We're failing to develop and utilize forms of intelligence that could identify entirely different problems, ones that traditional analytical thinking might not even recognize as significant. Remember Maria, the 8-year-old who questioned not just Piaget's water conservation task, but the purpose behind it? By 25, she had developed innovative educational programs that helped struggling students by addressing not just their academic gaps, but the underlying emotional and social factors that were interfering with their learning. Her success wasn't despite her unusual thinking patterns. It was because of them. But perhaps most importantly, she had found environments and mentors who recognized the value of her approach and helped her develop it rather than suppressing it in favor of more conventional thinking patterns. Not the replacement of analytical thinking with something else, but the integration of different cognitive approaches to create more comprehensive, more nuanced, more effective ways of understanding and addressing complex challenges. Your journey toward recognizing and developing these capabilities starts with a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of dismissing insights that don't fit traditional logical frameworks, you can learn to evaluate them based on their practical effectiveness and their ability to generate new understanding. The path forward requires both personal development and cultural change. On a personal level, it means learning to trust your cognitive capabilities even when they produce insights that others don't immediately understand. It means developing the courage to offer perspectives that might initially seem complicated or unconventional, but that could ultimately prove essential for addressing the challenges at hand. We also need cultural transformation that recognizes and values different forms of intelligence. We need organizational cultures that create space for different types of thinking and that understand the competitive advantage that comes from cognitive diversity. The future belongs to those who can think both analytically and integratively, who can navigate both certainty and ambiguity, who can solve both technical problems and human challenges. The question isn't whether you have these capabilities. It's whether you've learned to recognize and trust them, whether you've found environments that allow them to flourish, and whether you're willing to contribute to creating a world that desperately needs the unique perspectives and insights that you alone can offer. That shift in how you're seeing not just intelligence, but the very nature of what it means to think critically about the world around you. Because I've watched this transformation happen countless times, and it's beautiful every single time. But now you're beginning to understand that what you've been calling overthinking might actually be sophisticated analysis, that what others have labeled as complications might be recognition of important complexity, that your tendency to ask questions others don't think to ask might be exactly what our world needs more of, not less. You've been developing forms of intelligence that could help communities navigate conflicts that seem intractable, help organizations make decisions that serve both efficiency and human flourishing, help families communicate across differences that seem impossible to bridge. But here's what I need you to understand as we wrap up this journey together. Knowing about these capabilities isn't enough. Understanding Piaget's research isn't sufficient. The real transformation happens when you begin to actively develop these capabilities, when you seek out environments that allow them to flourish, when you find the courage to offer insights even when they don't match conventional expectations, when you become part of creating the cultural changes that will allow future generations to develop their full intellectual potential without having to sue. In fact, you can't do it alone, because the development of integrative critical thinking requires community, requires relationships with others who understand the value of different cognitive approaches, who can offer support when the world seems to prefer simpler answers to complex questions, who can help you continue growing in your capabilities while staying grounded in practical effectiveness. If today's exploration has resonated with you, if you're feeling that mixture of recognition and excitement and maybe a little bit of nervousness about what it might mean to really embrace and develop these capabilities, then I invite you to continue this journey with me. This isn't just academic information. These are tools for living more fully, thinking more effectively, and contributing more meaningfully to the challenges and opportunities that surround us every day. When you choose to continue learning alongside us, you're not just investing in your own development, you're contributing to a cultural shift that could benefit countless others who are still struggling to recognize and trust their own intellectual capabilities. You'll learn about the cognitive structures that enable ethical decision-making in ambiguous situations, understand why some people seem naturally able to navigate moral complexity while others get stuck in rigid rule-following, and discover practical approaches for developing moral intelligence that serves both personal integrity and social harmony.